Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Discussing history sometimes can be a tricky, notable thing that people try to approach and perceive as being the truth. And it's really more interesting when we're told one thing and discover that, well, as you dig a little bit deeper and find out what really goes on, that an inevitable truth appears and you find yourself questioning, well, why did I learn it this way when it was this way? Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is Irwin F. Gellman. His book, The President and the Apprentice, explores the relationship that one Dwight D. Eisenhower and Richard Nixon had over the course of more than 9 years. His book is The President and the Apprentice, and I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program our guest, Irwin Gellman. Irwin, thank you for joining us on the program. You bet. Now, this is quite a book. I mean, extensive when it comes to the subject matter. Tell us how you became so impassioned about this relationship and why it's important that people read this.
Well, I would like them to read it, but actually the way I became impassioned is my wife tricked me to go to the Richard Nixon Library in 1995 because she thought that this would be a good topic. We lived about 45 minutes from the library, but I had no interest in writing about Richard Nixon. But when the archivist took me and showed me the manuscripts that they were so fascinating that I have been hooked for the last 20 years on this.
Now, what was it that really got you hooked?
I had written 3 books on Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman, and I had never seen right-of-center communications like this. I have talked numerously across the United States and truly believe that the Nixon papers will be the finest collection of right-of-center correspondence in the second half of the 20th century.
Ah, fair enough. Now let's talk about the relationship that these two had. It was an interesting title, The President and the Apprentice, but what seems to really emerge is a lot talking about Richard Nixon, of course, but also the relationship that he had with President Dwight Eisenhower.
Well, the nature has been so mischaracterized for partisan and political purposes. You have a Eisenhower who was originally looked upon, as this elderly, smiling, not very smart golf-playing twit. And you have Nixon, who is the reincarnation of Satan because of Watergate, who was literally part of Dante's ninth circle of hell. And rather than either of those descriptions being correct, it was quite different. They were both very smart. Eisenhower was a brilliant organizer, and Nixon was a more than willing apprentice to aid and assist not only Eisenhower, but himself in learning more and more about how to run the federal government.
Now, it's interesting because Eisenhower is also one of those presidents. You know that he was president, but it doesn't seem that we really feel like we know a whole lot about him, but you certainly bring him to life in this book.
Well, thank you. And the idea behind Eisenhower was he was so self-assured, maybe because he had millions of lives that he had to decide upon every day in World War II or whatever, but he wasn't concerned so much about himself getting credit or him being egocentric or the nature of how many points he got. What he was interested in is what he called the team approach, that the team got the credit. And, of course, the United States moved forward and was better off for it.
Now, what's interesting is to note, again, back to the relationship of both Eisenhower and Nixon, is that when you talk about this team approach, that Nixon was somebody that Eisenhower really trusted when it came to overseas missions, things like Asia and so forth. Tell us more about that.
Well, again, unlike now when everybody relies on experts and you don't have to have your own vision because there's so many people that you can say know a vision for you, so you don't really have the need to have a global view. Eisenhower was stationed in Panama, was stationed in the Philippines, was stationed in North Africa, was stationed in Europe, was stationed in England, and of course was stationed in the United States. So over his 40-year career in the military, he gained a worldview. And so when he sent out Richard Nixon or his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, or his brother, Milton Eisenhower, he brought them into the White House first and said, here's what I'd like you to do. Here's the sensitive parts of this mission. And when they came back and they fulfilled Eisenhower's objectives, he debriefed them, and they would appear in front of the cabinet and or the National Security Council and or the public with Eisenhower's blessings. He had no need to do it himself. These people were great public spokesmen for what Eisenhower wanted to accomplish.
Mm-hmm. Now, speaking of speaking, the Checkers speech was something that Nixon is well known for.
Absolutely.
Now, tell us a little bit more about that, because the listeners may not be familiar with this one.
Well, the Checkers speech was the largest televised political speech up until that time. It was done in late September 23rd, 1952, because Nixon was charged in an article in the New York Post on September 18th, 1952, of having a secret millionaires trust fund. But after you read that banner headline and you read the actual article, it was nothing like that. The banner headline screamed and the article did not. But enough people came on board, and not surprisingly, the Democrats yelled and screamed that Nixon was doing something illegal and something unethical, and that Eisenhower should dismiss him from the ticket. So ultimately what happened was that the Republican Party and Eisenhower said that Nixon had to defend himself, and so he gave this speech, which went over brilliantly. There were maybe 3 million plus petitions, letters, telegrams saying how Nixon had behaved and that he should remain on the ticket. Eisenhower never asked Nixon to remove himself from the ticket, and probably the singular most important document I found in the Nixon papers was the notes that Eisenhower made while he watched the Nixon speech, which he gave to the manager of the Carlton Hotel where he was staying. And again, the mythology is that many people have written about, because it's such a great story, was Eisenhower was so angry at Nixon during the speech that he plunged his pencil or pen or whatever into the paper and ripped it. Well, the notes are there. There's nothing negative, only positives and praiseworthy things in the notes that Eisenhower took. And in addition to that, there were no rips. So the whole story of what happened with Eisenhower's response to the Checker speech flies in the face of reality.
Now, Nixon, of course, he's one of those presidents that he's sort of somebody that you either love or you hate, it seems like. And really, when you go back into his background, you begin to understand this was one of them rare people that comes into politics that's a real from-the-dirt, grind-it-to-the-grindstone sort of a guy in politics. I remember there was a nickname that he was given, Iron Butt, and people kind of laugh at that. Well, what does that mean? I said, well, because the guy was big time about sitting at the poker table and never leaving. And when you
that's
realize,
not why he was called Iron Butt.
Well, that's what it was. I'm quoting that from the book Nixon Land, so I don't know whether he was really called that. So,
and you're dealing with Rick Perlstein, who has no clue what he's talking about.
Okay.
Iron Butt came from Duke Law School, where Nixon would study in the library and not get up. Ergo, it was Iron Butt. And by the way, I wrote an article in a edited piece by Melvin Small called The Companion to Richard Nixon, where I point out that in Perlstein's Nixon Land, he makes an incredible amount of factual mistakes, and it doesn't surprise me he would get this wrong also.
Ah, well, there you go. See, and that's the funny thing about history is when you start seeing these things, then you take them to be the truth. And I didn't know. I mean, that's what he wrote in his book, and that's about as far as it goes there. But that, when someone like you comes along and does deep research and begins uncovering a lot more of the truth of what was going on there, it almost feels refreshing to know, well, that makes a lot more sense than what's typically being put out there.
And again, I don't blame you. What I do is I blame my colleagues and the journalists, and my mantra is they simply aren't willing to do the work.
Right.
They rather have a good-sounding story that is fallacious than do what needs to be done. And I'm not trying to pat myself on the back, but I looked at about 3 million pages of documents,
Wow.
not including books and articles and dissertations, etc. Because if you're going to do it, sir, you got to do it right, because I don't want folks like you or anybody not having the best information available.
Mm-hmm. Now, speaking of that information, let's talk about the Cold War and the McCarthy years, because that was certainly a dark period in American history there, and Eisenhower, had a lot to do with that changing. Tell us about that.
Well, again, the story is that Eisenhower sat passively by, allowed McCarthy to be a bombastic blowhard, and McCarthy self-destructed and died of cirrhosis of the liver.
Mm-hmm.
Quite to the contrary, Eisenhower was doing critical things in the first year of his presidency, used Nixon to mediate with McCarthy because Nixon had these bona fides as an anti-communist. And after McCarthy started going after Eisenhower's beloved army, remembering that Eisenhower graduated from West Point, Eisenhower was the man who was pulling the strings behind behind McCarthy's downfall. And one of the things that is usually not well documented was that Joseph Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy were all friends of McCarthy. In addition to that, when McCarthy died in 1957, Bobby Kennedy went to Appleton, Wisconsin, to be at McCarthy's funeral and asked the press not to report that he was there.
Fascinating stuff. This was also a time, too, with civil rights and the military being segregated, and he had a lot to do with the changing of those things as well.
And again, the perceived wisdom is that, Eisenhower and Nixon at worst were racists and at best were indifferent or disinterested in black civil rights. The fact is between Abraham Lincoln to Lyndon Johnson, the most active program in civil rights was under Eisenhower and Nixon. Eisenhower almost immediately, by executive order, desegregated Washington, D.C. And he, unlike Harry Truman, who issued the executive order in 1948 to desegregate the military, Eisenhower actually ordered his secretaries of Army, Air Force, and Navy not only to desegregate the divisions, but to desegregate the VA and desegregate schools. And in addition to that, if you want me to go on,
please.
The idea of the 1957 Civil Rights Act was mainly done by Eisenhower. And finally, the most active spokesman in the 1950s that advocated desegregation was Richard Nixon.
It's pretty fascinating to know that we kind of get that part wrong and credit somebody else to it, isn't it?
Well, the credit normally goes to Lyndon Johnson for passing the Civil Rights Act of 1957. Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Okay, Herbert Brownell, who was one of the most positive civil rights experts, drafted the legislation for the Civil Rights Act of 1957. More Republicans voted for the Civil Rights Act of 1957 than did Democrats. Eisenhower signed the Civil Rights Act of 1957, and Eisenhower implemented the Civil Rights Act of 1957. Can you tell me, do you think he had an active role in the Civil Rights Act?
Oh, boy, tough question.
I'm just saying, I mean, how in the world do you get Lyndon Johnson passing the Civil Rights Act when, you know, just on the sheer face of it, it doesn't make sense?
It's a pretty incredible stretch to actually figure out why we were able to, you know, give this guy the credit that he has been given for something like that.
Well, you got to believe that Lyndon Johnson had great spin.
Now, how about foreign affairs? You know, these two really worked together, and as I was saying earlier in the program, that he really entrusted Nixon to be able to handle himself because Nixon, you know, he had swagger. He certainly knew his way when it came to doing, you know, his job. Tell us about that.
Well, again, the remarkable thing about Eisenhower was how well-trained he was and had a worldview. And he would send Nixon out to do incredibly delicate things, telling Syngman Rhee after the Korean armistice, if you didn't behave, the U.S. would withdraw support, telling Chiang Kai-shek that any hope he had of an invasion of mainland China was not going to happen. Going to Japan and telling the Japanese that they were going to have to rearm because the United States was not forever going to be its military shield. And he goes to Central America, he goes to South America. One of the major roles that Nixon Eisenhower plays is Nixon goes to Austria during the Hungarian Revolt. And Eisenhower uses him to publicize the plight of the Hungarian freedom fighters to change American immigration law, to give these people and other people who are displaced persons from World War II and afterwards, behind the Iron Curtain, a place to seek refuge in the United States. And very few people, one, know about it, and very few people, if any, give Eisenhower credit for having that kind of foresight to do that, which, by the way, 10 or 15 years later does become law.
Mm-hmm. Now, another thing that's been kind of overlooked, especially in the history books, is the Hungarian Revolution with the Polish students there that staged a spontaneous demonstration and how that was dealt with. Tell us about that.
Well, again, you know, the remarkable nature of American foreign policy is having a big mouth. And one of the big mouths is we're going to liberate Eastern Europe. It was also called rollback. And the idea behind it was somehow some people yelled and screamed that we should go into Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union would cower in the might of the United States, which of course was ridiculous. Mm-hmm. And President Eisenhower, who had served as the Supreme Commander of the North American Treaty Organization, knew it. And so his basic position was, we will encourage democracy and we will hope that the Soviet Union leaves Eastern Europe as it does when the evil empire falls. But we're not going to start World War III over something that's a no-win situation.
Mm-hmm. Now, when we look at domestic affairs now, they were pretty active as well, especially when it came to the solution with steel. And tell us about that. It was really interesting to see that you could see that kind of advocacy actually happening for the workers at such a high level of government.
Well, again, you know, the nature of the administration or any Republican administration being anti-labor, again, you question the credulity of what these folks are claiming. Eisenhower and Nixon knew, and especially Nixon with the upcoming election, knew that he had to have a fundamentally sound steel industry because it was one of the fundamentals of American industry. Mm-hmm. So, Nixon, with Eisenhower's blessings, mediated between big unions and big steel companies. And they came up with a decision that both sides could live with and the government could live with, and it became one of the major cornerstones of what Nixon did. And quite frankly, was very quickly forgotten by Democrats because it didn't help them that Nixon was able to solve this complex problem.
There's so much we could talk about in this book here. It's incredibly detailed, and I'm sure that people who have read this have actually been surprised by a lot of the facts that you've been able to present here to really change the face of how we have seen things. And I always find that to be a remarkable feat, especially for someone who pores over more than 3 million documents. That's pretty incredible.
Well, I have to tell you, I was surprised. and quite frankly, some of the stuff, I became very angry. I became angry over the claim that Eisenhower and Nixon talked about niggers, and Eisenhower had a valet named Sergeant John Money from August of 1942 and was actually a pallbearer at Eisenhower's, an honorary pallbearer, as Money was too sick, at Eisenhower's funeral. Money's wife, Dolores Money, worked with Sergeant Money from 1945 and worked for Mamie after the former president died, and after Mamie died, worked to help raise Susan Eisenhower, the granddaughter's children. And the various interviews with Dolores Money, she's angry that various people claimed that the Eisenhowers were anti-African American. And again, the nature of how people tell the story. Did you see the movie The Butler?
Yes.
Okay.
It's interesting you would bring that up because I was actually having a dream about that very thing where Forrest Whitaker was being a butler, and so it must have had something to do with this interview today or something. It's interesting you bring that up. Probably
one of the great scenes is Robin Williams playing Eisenhower sitting in the Oval Office talking with Herb Brownell about seeing Orville Faubus, about the Little Rock incident. There's only one problem. Eisenhower was in Newport, Rhode Island. So how in the world could the butler in Washington, D.C., maybe there was some kind of seance? He was never there. And then they have this other scene where Nixon is walking into a pantry to give 3 black stewards, Nixon buttons. All this stuff is done just to belittle these people. And by the way, Nixon started a social fraternity at Whittier College, and one of the people that he advocated coming was a man named William Brock, who was the starting halfback on the Whittier football team. And you'll never guess what race William Brock was. He was black. After they both graduate, Brock writes Nixon a letter in August of 1952 and says, "Dick, I am very sorry to bother you, but I became disillusioned after I graduated and joined one of the Communist Front organizations, and they have pulled my security clearance from doing defense contracting. Can you help me get my clearance back?" And for the rest of the vice presidency, without any fanfare, Nixon worked with Brock to get his clearance back. And yet, how in the world can you write these stories and not know the reality?
It really does astound me, because there was at one moment as I was reading in the book where apparently former New York Governor Tom Dewey, who ran for the presidency 3 times, was involved in deciding that Richard Nixon would be on the ticket with Ike Eisenhower. And, when you go back in that guy's record, this Tom Dewey, and you realize that, to me, from some of the things that I've uncovered over the years, I think might not have been a good thing for America.
Well,
and now this guy's in a position, along with a committee, to decide whether or not Richard Nixon's going to be on the ticket or not. And, that just seemed kind of scary there for a bit.
Well, some of the other stuff that's scary to me is that Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who I considered a friend, published 1,000 Days in 1965, and Theodore Sorensen published Kennedy in 1965, and both basically claim that Eisenhower was responsible for the Bay of Pigs. and for some reason, and I don't know why, they don't quote from an article that Earl Mazo did when he interviewed Eisenhower after those books came out, and the headlines read, Ike says Bay of Pigs was all JFK's.
Mm-hmm.
And again, Eisenhower didn't even know about the Bay of Pigs. And just on the face of it, can you imagine the man that plans the greatest and largest amphibious landing in the world is going to have a fiasco like the Bay of Pigs?
Right.
Why would people even think that that's reality?
And that's what's funny. It's sort of if somebody says something or writes it in a book or says it on the radio or says it on television, it must be true. And now we're in a day and an age of the Internet, where fractured information is so abundant, it surprises me anybody really even takes the time to discover what the truth actually is.
Well, again, I don't mean to belabor this. You got to do the work. If you're not willing to do the work, don't write about it. Mm-hmm. You can write all kinds of things, but when I'm dealing with my public, they expect me to be the best I can be. Mm-hmm. I take that very seriously. And when you're one of the great things that everybody writes about, headlines this and headlines this, Nixon uses psychiatrist. Well, Nixon never used a psychiatrist. And yet the claim is out there all the time that Nixon, during his vice presidency, was seeing a shrink. Well, I have Arnold Hutchnecker's notes. He never used him as a psychiatrist. Arnold Hutchnecker was never a board-certified psychiatrist. But you know what really is the icing on top of the cake? Hutchnecker testifies in November 1973 at Gerald Ford's hearings to be approved as vice president under the pain of perjury, and both House members and Senate members asked Hutchnecker the same 2 questions. Dr. Hutchnecker, did you ever treat Nixon for psychological problems? No. Dr. Hutchnecker, did you ever treat Nixon for psychiatric problems? No. And yet, the story still is out there that Nixon had his own psychiatrist.
I got to say, it's just, like I said, I'm looking forward to reading the rest of the book here because there's so much detail that really takes you back to a time where it's good to understand what our nation was like and how we were making the decisions and moving the way that we were was happening here, and of course taking away that cloud of myth that surrounds these 2 men, especially their relationship. The book is The President and the Apprentice. It's Eisenhower and Nixon, 1950 through 1961. How can people find this book? Where can they get it? Is there a website?
My website is not fully done yet, but they could get it at Amazon, they can get it at Yale, they can get it at Barnes & Noble. It's out in the marketplace everywhere. I would imagine all major bookstores are carrying it. And again, what I tried to do in this volume was to basically change the way we look at not only these two major epical figures, but to change the way that people have reported incorrectly on what happened and what the motivations were under the Eisenhower presidency. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't, I don't quite understand, but I do understand the inertia to accept change. People just don't want to believe whether it's true or not is kind of irrelevant. Mm-hmm. It's just that there is this need to accept wrong-headed material.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of similar to the big debate that's been going on for many years about whether or not Shakespeare actually wrote the things that was claimed that he wrote. And, and you got to take a look at, there's a whole industry around the works of Shakespeare. You start rocking that boat and saying, well, Shakespeare really didn't do this, and you probably have a lot of evidence that supports that belief. But the fact is, you now have an industry of people that say, well, we've been getting it wrong this whole time, now what do we do?
and again, the nature of what those folks do is they're hypothecating various issues. Mm-hmm. In my case, I think I have about 200 pages of footnotes.
Right.
and the importance is I'm not trying to conjure up any new theories. I'm just taking what happened in the political campaigns, what happened in domestic circles, what happened in foreign policy circles, what happened between these two men, their health issues, their personality issues, and looking at them on a microscopic level to see what really were the main themes throughout their lives, and nobody was willing to do that. So you have this new change that says, well, we were wrong about Eisenhower. He was really, a brilliant president. The only problem is they don't tell you why.
Right.
So why in the world is it any different that Eisenhower was a dud or Eisenhower was a genius if you don't have any reasoning of why this happened? So I tried to fill in that void and say, here's what happened, here is what they were doing, here's how smart they really were, and you run up against the amount of, I got a stake in this. I'm not going to rewrite my textbook to show that I've been wrong for 30 or 40 years. Mm-hmm. I like what I wrote. Mm-hmm. And besides, my publisher doesn't want to have a massive change.
I don't blame him. It'd be quite a change if it had to be.
and again, you know as well as I do that, just your earlier comment on the iron butt, how hard would it have been to check the sources and find out why Nixon was called an iron butt? I mean, because he was sitting somewhere playing poker?
Right.
That doesn't even make. I mean, he had an iron butt. What was he sitting on? The ace of spades? Or
right.
I mean, why would that? Why would that be? Part of your work when one, it doesn't make sense, and two, it wasn't real.
Mm-hmm. Irwin, first of all, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to join us here on the program today. And the book is widely available. It's The President and the Apprentice. It's Eisenhower and Nixon. I think it's a fantastic read because it shapes up and gets you to see, well, that makes a lot more sense than what we've been handed when it comes to historical accounts. And I want to thank you for taking the time to join us and talk with us on the program today about that.
Well, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. And again, I don't get any pleasure in writing a corrective, but I was just stunned to see from the get-go how incorrect the work was and how sloppy, the historical record has been made, and hopefully at least you have some kind of standard now that will give you good material on what really occurred.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. Irwin, thank you so much for joining us here on the program today.
Well, thank you, sir, for your time.
You bet. The President and the Apprentice is the book. Check it out and get yourself corrected on the real history of what happens. As he was saying over and over again, do your homework. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. You've been listening to the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.